With the fresh release of Resident Evil Village, lots of people were and are still excited to jump on board and play the game for themselves. With so much talk about the game villains and rich story, we think it's just right to take a trip back in time and look at how the game changed over the years. Now, with every new release, there are people who love the game and people who don't. A lot of people look at Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil Village and feel like they changed the game so much that it lost its charm. But let us ask ourselves, what really makes a Resident Evil game? Is it the gameplay, the story, or is it the bad voice acting of the first games? Well, today we're about to find out why the franchise changed so much over the years. Welcome to Evo Chronicles, and this is the evolution of the Resident Evil franchise. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and hit the bell icon for more evolution videos. Let us go back to the 90s, where this genre-defining game was born. Some say that the game Sweet Home is the true first survival horror game. It was released by EA in 1989, and if we compare the two games, we can see that there's a lot of similarities when it comes to the gameplay. You can see that the player movements and camera angles are very similar. So this is where Resident Evil got its inspiration. This was the game that laid the groundwork for many horror games to come. It was a huge success, which is why so many games copied the formula. Most games before this were mostly point-and-click games that were more like horror-themed than actually scary. Capcom released its first Resident Evil game in 1996 on the PC and PlayStation, and a year later on the Sega Saturn. This game was something new to the game industry, and gamers loved it. This game caused a huge wave for years to come, only to earn its place as a staple of the horror game genre, along with games like Alone in the Dark, Sweet Home, and of course, Silent Hill. Speaking of which, a new video we're working on will be covering the Silent Hill franchise and its evolution, so if you don't want to miss that out, make sure to subscribe. The first Resident Evil game was something unique and special. With detailed environments and pre-rendered lighting, it gave the artists working for Capcom the possibility to make the game look spooky and dark. But the game used clunky controls and fixed cameras. And although this was a byproduct of the technical limitations back in the day, it was also one of the biggest reasons why people loved it so much. If the game was played in the third-person perspective, it wouldn't be as scary or as exciting. The way you used to move the character was by pressing left and right buttons to rotate, and forwards and back to move in the intended direction. This made the game significantly harder to play, especially for someone who doesn't play video games a lot. So when you're walking down a corridor and encounter a monster, you can't just simply run away. This gives the player the sense of helplessness, and it's made the game more immersive. This was the formula that the next Resident Evil games will follow for the next decade. The first game was a commercial success, with more than 9 million copies being sold across the 3 platforms, which was a huge deal back in the day. Ultimately, Capcom wanted to make more money and double down on the first game's success. So logically, 2 years later, we got Resident Evil 2, which was more or less similar to the first game, but even better. In this installment, they focused more on the story by expanding on its worldwide scale, taking the player to Raccoon City, unlike the previous game where you explored the mansion, as well as adding better cutscenes and really giving the true fans of the franchise some incentive to play the game. Besides the actual horror, the story was a big part of the second game. You discover how people of Raccoon City got infected and the origins of the virus, and also the involvement of the Umbrella Corporation. But what is most notable about the second game is the addition of the tyrant Mr. X, or T-00. An unkillable tall dude who stalks you throughout the game, making the whole game much more intense. And I'm sure you've heard about the Resident Evil 2 remake. In comparison, the remake and the original are totally different. All the characters are totally different from their original versions. The 1998 characters were too confident, which didn't really help the horror aspect of the genre. In the remake, however, the characters are genuinely scared, and the tyrant is even more determined to get to you. But anyway, after the release of Resident Evil 2, Capcom realized that this franchise is going to get much bigger in the future, and so they wanted to make even more games. A year later, in 1999, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was released. This game initially was a spin-off starring Jill Valentine. Meanwhile, another game that was going to be called Resident Evil 3 was being developed, but due to complications and short development time, a year after Resident Evil 3, we got Resident Evil Veronica. Both games were being developed at the same time, so some people consider Code Veronica to be the real sequel to RE2. In Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, you play as Jill Valentine, The game still had the same mechanics from the previous games, but probably the biggest addition was the Nemesis. And overall, the game became more action-oriented, with the addition of the quick turn and dodge-in, which hints at what the game would become in the next installment. Code Veronica was a special release at the time. The developers ditched the pre-rendered backgrounds that the previous games heavily relied on. This game was developed to be released on the Dreamcast, but although the game was a bit silly when it comes to the cutscene department, it definitely was a fun game to play. A couple years down the line, the developers looked back at how the game has changed over the years, and with the PS2 and GameCube bringing lots of new things to the table, a remake of the first game was released, along with Resident Evil 0, which took place before the main story of the first game. Both games were a huge leap forward when it comes to the environment and quality, but unfortunately they didn't reach the number of sales Capcom was hoping for. They were mostly criticized to still having the same clunky mechanics and not really bringing anything new to the table. They were neither scary nor fun, as people got used to the jump scare formula of Capcom. When Resident Evil 4 hit the shelves, people realized that this is not the typical Resident Evil game. You play as Leon, but gone are the days of fixed camera angles. It became a third-person shooter. The game is much more fast-paced now, and although it's nowhere near how the classic Resident Evil game feels, we can't deny that this game pioneered a new aesthetic. While playing, you had different choice of weapons with varying levels of power, and different ways for you to deal with situations. The player now had some sense of strength, so naturally the game lost its horror aspect. The classic zombies were also gone, and instead we got some crazy villagers sprinting at you with cleavers and axes. The AI was much more intelligent this time, which also brought new challenges. The introduction of the new aiming system gave the player the ability to shoot different parts of the body, affecting the enemy. But probably the most unforgettable thing about Resident Evil 4 is sending villagers flying all over the place with the roundhouse kick. This is where the massively successful game known as Resident Evil 5 comes in. The overwhelming positive reactions and massive amounts of copies sold for Resident Evil 4 only meant one thing: fans want more of what Resident Evil 4 is. Capcom ditched all the horror aspect and made the game even more action-oriented. The reason why this game was such a massive success is that back then when it was released, so many other games were action games as well. The genre was the most popular and still is to this day, followed by adventure and fighting games. Resident Evil didn't really fit in any of these categories, so when it changed the formula to appeal to a massive audience, many previous Resident Evil fans and even people who never played any of the previous games got the game, mainly because of the co-op aspect of the game. And let us be honest, nobody cared about the story that much. Most people just played the co-op game because it was the most amount of fun anyone can have. Following Resident Evil 5 is Resident Evil 6. It was a super underwhelming game for many fans of the franchise, mainly because it's lost sight of what's good about the game in general. It became a simple shooter game with the only ties to the previous games being the title and the story. And even the story was pretty ridiculous when it comes to the way it was presented. But this doesn't mean that Resident Evil 6 wasn't a success in the grand scheme of things. The game also sold millions of copies. With many unforgettable moments and fun, it surely deserved the spot. Resident Evil 7 wasn't exactly what fans were hoping for when they said they would like the old formula back, but the new direction the game took was probably the right choice. The reasons why the first 3 games worked the way they did because of the technical limitations, so trying to recreate the same thing now wouldn't be a good idea. The game now became first person, the pace is much slower, and it honestly feels like a Resident Evil game. Beside the graphics and sound design of course, the story also took a huge turn when it comes to how the characters are portrayed. The enemies also felt more grounded and real, with the crafting mechanics and resource management back to how it was. Many fans have embraced the new look of the game, and for good reason. Capcom realized that the story is what will make the game stand out. And so eventually, Resident Evil Village was released following the story of Ethan Winters from the previous game. This installment used the same mechanics of the previous game, while probably tweaking a few things, but overall the writing is now far better than all Resident Evil games. Resident Evil Village gave us an in-depth look at Ethan's backstory, as well as all the lores of the game, and of course the origins of the virus and the involvement of Chris Redfield and the Umbrella Corporation. So that was it for the history and evolution of Resident Evil. If you ask me what is the most iconic game of all time, I'd put this franchise at the top 10 list. So what do you think of the latest installment? Was it the right move from Capcom or did they mess up? Tell us in the comments below. But for now, I'll see you in the next video.